This is episode 184. I'm Tommy Serafinsky, and you're listening to the Conservation and Science podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. And in this episode, we are back at talking about science with the world-class scientists. Our guest today is Professor Marcus Collier. Marcus is an associate professor of sustainability science at the Trinity College Dublin. And we are going to talk about novel ecosystems. What are they? What role do they play in relation to climate change and biodiversity loss? While at it, we are going to talk about non-native species and whether we always should eradicate them, or maybe in some cases we should embrace the non-native species. I also asked Marcus what is Anthropocene, and mainly whether the term is a scientific term now, or maybe it is geared towards some different audiences. We are also talking about nature-based solutions. What are they, and what does it mean that there are nature-based solutions? And while at it, we are also going to touch on the subject of urban environments and what are they. So I think that gives you a pretty good idea what this episode is going to be about. And so without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen, my discussion with Professor Marcus Collier. Marcus, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
I was delighted to see that you very quickly accepted my invitation. And, novel ecosystems and everything that is related to that is very interesting to me. And we're going to dive into these topics today. Before we start, would you mind give to our listeners and viewers a quick introduction, who you are, what you specializing in your research?
Sure. Okay. So my name is Marcus Collier. I'm the Associate Professor of Sustainability Science here in the School of Natural Sciences, which is 4 disciplines, and I'm in the discipline of botany in Trinity College in Dublin. The area of research that I've been doing for quite a long time, both as an active participant, and in my previous life, I had a career as working with an NGO and working in a charity, and also the research is working at the interface between people and ecosystems, the social ecological systems. So where we know much about how people and society has impacted ecosystems. But also ecosystems and nature has an impact back on us, which is less studied. So I look at that. So the area I work in has a lot to do with the ecosystem services that nature provides to people, including cultural ecosystem services, in nature-based solutions, which is where we can innovate with nature to, help to tackle some of our large global issues, but also benefit biodiversity as a return. And so on. So that's the main area that I work in. Ironically, I do more social science than ecological science that I would have done in the past. But now it just changes every day. I'll be doing both. So it's almost like I'm ambidextrous.
Gotcha. Like it seems like wherever you touch, the social sciences have such a big part of it, of everything now that, especially when you talk about conservation and nature and all those things, that's very natural, I would say. Marcus, you said, use the phrase human-nature interface. And I got to start here just to have a foundation for this conversation. Human-nature interface suggests like that humans are not part of nature. There are something outside of nature and they're interfacing with nature. So being a little bit of a devil's advocate, I ask this question: are humans natural? Are humans part of nature?
We couldn't be more part of nature if we want. We are part of nature. Nature is part of us. But for quite literally thousands of years, and there's been writers that go back beyond Aristotle who talk about how humans separate themselves from nature. We go to nature. It is outside. It's a view we have. It's like a window or a screen that we look at and we see it's out there. We're inside in our created homes and our created securities behind the force field. But in reality, we are driven by nature. We evolved as a result of nature. It's a process that has given rise to us, and we are very much part of nature. However, one of the biggest problems we have as a creature is we don't know that we are a creature. And it has given rise to so much of the problems, including the type of behavior that we use, that has destroyed a great deal of the parts of our planet and our climate and so on. And it is that disconnect, the removal of ourselves from nature, that we could put our finger on and say, well, if we could at least fix that, if we could reconnect, there is a very, very big chance that we could maybe alter our behavior to be more sustainable. Not all humans are like that. There are quite a lot of humans, for example, from indigenous communities in different parts of the world, up until relatively recently, and in some cases still, that are still quite part of nature. But still, indigenous peoples and ancient peoples also caused a lot of extinctions and problems. Nothing like the global effects that we might have now, with possibly some major extinctions we might, like mammoth and so on. But then we're not 100% sure whether it's climate or it's environment or hunting or so on. So we still, even in our earliest days, in the days we hadn't really developed a society as such that we currently know, we still had technology, very rudimentary technology. We still had technology that impacted nature. So yes, it is, unfortunately, we do tend to see ourselves as separate, but we are, in fact, we couldn't be more like nature even if we tried.
That's very comprehensive and answer that I like. It's very, very detailed. By the way, before we jump into the talking about the novel ecosystems, I got to ask you about this term Anthropocene. Is that a thing? Is it like officially used? Because I posed that question some time ago, and I had various answers. Some people were like, yeah, definitely we're in the Anthropocene because, our whatever we do is visible everywhere, like microplastics are.
Absolutely,
from the bottom of the ocean to the upper atmosphere. But then there are people who are just going on the rant, like, no, this is just like a term created for the media, for like where we stand with the Anthropocene. Is it official?
Well, it was official for a while, and then the geologists had a meltdown and decided that no, it's not official. When some geologists had a further meltdown and left the geologists that were doing it, and it became a bit of a bun fight. Scientists are hilarious when they are fighting. It's the drama. It's best soap opera possible. If you are in the room whenever there's a controversial, I might come to that later on, but whenever there's a controversial issue, scientists can get quite controversial. So people like Earl Ellis in the University of Maryland, who is very much trying to promote this idea of Anthropocene, for which people won the Nobel Prize, this idea of the pervasiveness of humans that will never be not part of the geological record. He resigned spectacularly from the committee. He wrote of course, whenever someone resigns or writes a long letter, then everybody reads it, and it's really quite funny and dramatic and quite serious too. So yes, the term is still being used. It's not so much for media, though. It's more aimed at policymakers. And so if we can tell people that we live in an age that, for example, in a million years' time, if I took a group of students, miraculously I survive, of course, I took a group of students and we drilled down through rock and we got to a layer that was the 21st and 20th century, 18th century, 19th century, we will find a band that we will be able to say, looking at the nuclear residue, looking at the microplastic residue, as you mentioned, and looking at other things, will be forever around this earth that we will be identified. Now, how thick that layer is, of course, is up to us. And it's likely to get thicker and thicker the more we globalize and dominate the planet. So it is a term that is being used a lot. There are people who will refuse to use that term, but I would use it less in terms of how I would speak with the public, because that is too big a word and too confusing a word. But I would definitely use it when I'm talking with economists, politicians, and I would explain why I would use it, because it's in the explanation of why you use it that you're able to explain, to clarify that, our place in history is sealed forever, and your job is to make sure that it's not always really forever. So if you just
this is not embarrassing someone discovers
it's not
it.
intended to embarrass. I think that doesn't help anybody because no one person can put an end to anything, despite of what people might think. But it's intended to focus and to get people on message that if we know what we're talking about here, at least we now all agree that this is a problem, and it affects different peoples in different ways over different periods of times, almost entirely negatively. So if that's the case, then we can agree, yes, we're in the Anthropocene, and it comes on the back of a huge amount of research that's done into the great expansion and the way we have a great acceleration, the way we've changed over a very short space of time, and how technologies change over a space of time, and how we use technology and how we mine it and so on. And the intention there is not to stop things. The intention is to try to mitigate and moderate, and with the possible just turn things in the reverse direction to try to take pressure off the limits we have, because there's only so many resources available.
Yeah, you would imagine that in a million years or whatever, someone will be looking at the Anthropocene layer in the rocks, and they will say like, wow, look at them, how successful they are. They dominated the whole planet, right? While we looking at it, and it's like, it's probably not good.
Well, actually, that's what we're doing that already, but not with our planet. We're doing it with other planets. So the searching for other planets around these becomes so much more sophisticated now. They're looking for the examples of Anthropocene in other planets. They're looking for those chemicals, those indicators, those markers that tell us that it's a nuclear society, it's a microplastic society. And with telescopes like James Webb telescopes and some of the other most sophisticated ones that are coming out now, we're able to chart and map not just what a planet might look like, but we're able to get great detail just on gas analysis alone of what's going on underneath the atmosphere. And there's a lot of speculation that they've found, possibly or may find, examples or that footprint of a species that is technological. That's not going to say human, obviously, but a species that is technological. But it's getting closer and closer to being decided upon. But just as the argument at the Anthropocene on Earth is divisive, I can just imagine what it's going to be like for those astronomers who tried to propose an Anthropocene in another world, because then our geologists are going to say, hang on a second, we don't like it here, we're not going to agree to it there. And so we get back to the argument again, which can be fun. But it's in the argument that good science is done. That's the best thing about it.
Yes, it's incredibly interesting. Okay, Marcus, let's come back to our planet and talk about and talk about novel ecosystems.
Right.
I don't want to tee up this question in any way. I'm just going to ask you straight up. Can you unpack for us the term novel ecosystem? What is a novel ecosystem? And then we take it from there.
Okay, so yes, it's even in the phrase is very new. It's novel itself. So continuing with that Anthropocene discussion, if we agree that everywhere on the planet has felt the footprint of human progress in some form or other, we everywhere we go, as you mentioned, bottom of the oceans, up in the atmosphere. It is quite true that all the Earth's ecosystems, terrestrial or aquatic or wherever, all ecosystems have had an impact, some greater than others. So, for example, the ecosystems that are cities, for example, are the most changed. So what they did, what around the late 1990s, early 2000s, just ecologists, people who are in the area of restoration ecology. That's the you might be familiar. We are in the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration, and we just passed the restoration ecology restoration law in Europe with great difficulty. This idea of we can repair, we can return to a past, we can bring back something that is gone, and even if we can't, we should aim to do it, which is very laudable. And the work that I was doing in the past, still do, and a lot of people are doing, is basically trying to restore ecosystem, replanting, rewilding, and so on. But others have argued that there are some ecosystems that no matter what we do, that we will never be able to be fully like an ecosystem that was once there. The first problem we have here is we don't know what the once there means. We don't have a particular pinpoint in history that says, if we go back to that point, we're back at the correct state. Because these ecologists will understand that ecosystems are dynamic. They're not in a steady state. So going back something can actually maybe quite retrograde. So if you keep something static, it doesn't evolve, it doesn't change, it doesn't adapt to its environment. We would not have evolved if our environment was static and it didn't move, didn't change, if there wasn't ice ages and meteors and all the other things that have happened in the past. That gave rise to this current batch of species that are available to see and hear and watch on the planet. However, the idea of a novel ecosystem is these anthropogenic ecosystems, human-created ecosystems, accidental or deliberate, doesn't really matter, that will always be different than anything that was there in the past, but they maintain themselves going forward. And what we're talking about here is maybe restoring in a more future-oriented direction and less looking to the past. Though that caused a tremendous amount of stink when it came out first, and the people who are still around. We had a recent meeting to hopefully organize an event next year in Dublin where we could have the first global discussion on novel ecosystems. And we realized that it created a lot of heat, but not a lot of light. So we could see all the anger, but no one really got to understand what we're talking about. So that's what we are talking about with these novel ecosystems. It's not intended. The reason why it was so controversial when it came out first, one of the big reasons was that I could go as a developer to a politician and say, see that forest over there, we're going to cut the whole thing down and you're going to get a nice bit of money. And the politician said, well, look, I'm not a green person. I'm no dummy though, but I know there will be some stink about that. Well, all you got to do is say, when it's finished, we'll let it go, we'll leave it, and it'll be a novel ecosystem when we're finished. So it can be misused and abused. And the irony of it is the word novel tends to make people think it's new and exciting. But in fact, in ecological terms, novel can actually be, wait a second, it's a bit novel. It's like telling a politician the decision they made is courageous. If you know what I mean, it's like wait, what did I do wrong? So that's what we're trying to get across here. So perhaps the phrase is clumsy, but the sentiment is about that these ecosystems, from small habitats like urban parks and so on, right the way through to huge areas. So for example, Hawaii, Galapagos, there can be considered novel ecosystems because there are species there that we introduced deliberately and we introduced accidentally, that no matter what we do, it's never going to change. We can go in there and spend billions restoring something, and the minute we walk away, they're all going to come back. Plants live longer than we do. Animals, move more than we like them to. And things then evolve, things change. So no matter what we do, we're just fiddling with the deck chairs on the Titanic. They're going in a certain direction, whether we like it or not. And all we're doing is just delaying the process. So the novel ecosystem people say, perhaps we should investigate, not embrace them, but look at do they have biodiversity values? Yes, they do. Do they have other values? Yes, they have ecosystem services. And they also, as I would argue, are an access for people to reconnect people with nature. May not be the nature of the past, as some idyllic past, but it is still nature. Let's not call it anything other than just an assemblage of plants and animals that some of them look nice, some of them smell nice, and we just get on with them. They may not be, we wouldn't be able to discern that that's particularly invasive plant or is not supposed to be there. It's for humans to say, okay, at least I know what a wild space looks like.
I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into this concept because just, we talked on this podcast a lot about, for example, rewilding, right? And then there's this very common line of discussion, let's say, like, oh, so you want to bring things back. So where do you exactly want to bring them back, right? Are you want to bring them to Pleistocene baseline? Are you want to bring them to, first human contact, or, and then geographically it's all a mess, right? And then I recently read that even Neanderthals turned out to be deforesting huge swaths of land, right? So it's not really specific to Homo sapiens, it was other species of Homo were always also deforesting and modifying and so on. So in a sense, like hunter-gatherers, again, we had a episode about hunter-gatherers. We're moving, like moving species around, right? So are these novel ecosystems are not that novel at all. They were just always changing.
Yeah, I did. I actually had a paper, novel, not new. I don't think I ever finished it, but the idea, you're dead correct. And actually, we're not the only species at all. Ants, termites completely shape the environment around them. Elephants.
Elephants, yeah. Exactly.
There's lots of animals that change the environment, not accidentally, deliberately. The whole job of a beaver is to completely change a river to suit itself, to create a home for itself. And to
ecosystem engineers.
And there's quite a lot of them, and and the more we look at the more we study these individual species, but also the ecosystem that they're in, the more we realize just how much they have shaped that ecosystem. Depending on how far a bird can fly with a load of stones or seeds in its stomach before it poops it out again, that is the flight time to seed ratio. It can tell us what an ecosystem could look like. There are so many different things. So now, nothing nearly as dramatic as ours, because a lot of animals who do change their environment have been doing so for millions of years in some cases, and that have generated, and that is the ecosystem. That change is the ecosystem. Well, we've come in and done some much more radical, short-lived and deliberate changes. But you're dead right. We have evidence of prehistoric people, Neolithic peoples especially, who moved species around. They kept species. First of all, they started domesticating things. They took pets of wolves and they started domesticating things. And I'm fully sure it's because they had the same genetic makeup as we today, where they just see an abandoned puppy of a wolf and they go, can we keep it, Dad, Grog, whatever we call him? And they go, oh, sure, he'll eat us out of house and home, but he'll be ours. And it's somewhat simplistic to think that's how it could have started, but we do have we are not different. We are still the same as those early humans. We are identical to them, with maybe some very minor, peripheral changes, that like height and hair color and skin colors and all that sort of thing. But more or less, right, absolutely identical in terms of our emotional response to nature. The emotional response to nature's connectivity with nature is the thing that we're talking about all the time. And when we're talking about we're damaging nature, we're talking about we're damaging ourselves. Not to spiritual sort of way, but in the same that we're impacting our existence and the ability for us to have a long and healthy life, because we actually have damaged the thing that we should be more connected to. But yeah, long time. Time is the huge issue here, isn't it? It's
yes. It's always where you. But listen, so these novel ecosystems. I'm gonna ask you about the potential controversy here between, or tension, maybe better word, between traditional restoration ecology and then let's call them novel ecosystem crowd, because while researching or reading one of the books or one of the previous episodes, I there was a whole chapter about we have this one group of restoration ecologies who wants to restore the ecosystem to their previous state, whatever that previous state is. That surely they have some goals and objectives, and then the novel ecosystem, hey, this ecosystem moved forward so much that what you're doing doesn't make sense. We should embrace what's currently there, and then it's at some point is at odds, isn't it, with restoration ecology? Should we restore? And where do you draw the line between we actually want to improve and nature restoration law, right? We want to restore nature rather than nature move forward, new ecosystem law. So can you, it's a very open question, but can you elaborate on this? Because I'm sure there is an element of tension there.
Oh, there's a huge element of tension because the restoration, so there's restoration ecology and ecological restoration. So restoration ecology tends to be the study and the understanding, like the proof that it works. And ecological restoration tends to be the practice, the companies, or ecological engineering, if you want. They're the people who are doing it, the Army, US Corps of Army Engineers. Those are the people who are, and there's huge companies around the world who are charged because when, for example, a mining company is given its license, when it's finished, it must restore, it must pay restitution to the land in some form or other. In some cases, that might meaning reflooding or rewetting if they were draining something. Obviously, if they've removed a mountain, not going to be able to replace them. But but essentially to try and make it safe and make it return it to its natural state as much as possible. So there's lots of companies, and you can see the tension there. If people are being paid to restore to a particular past, or that's their job, and you say, well, just stop doing anything active, just allow it to happen, give it a bit more time, a bit more patience, and nature will just do it itself. We don't have to pay a penny. That's one way, maybe it's like a cynical way of looking at the tension, but the tension really resolved around the ecologists, criticizing each other for, like, the restoration ecologists saying, well, the novel ecosystem people are taking the wind out of our sails, and that's making us look stupid in front of the politicians, the ones who are trying to influence. Because if politicians get wind of this, or if planners, or if anyone says, they could just as easily argue back and say, well, why should we pay thousands for you to replant this grassland? Whereas if we just let it go, a grassland will become, eventually, it won't be necessarily the same grassland as the one that was dug up 50 years ago, but it will be the one that is most suited to today's climate, perhaps. So a lot of it is semantics. A lot of it is, individual ecologists who have come from a very specific discipline background, their botanical or zoological discipline, where they say, like, we're trying to conserve a specific species. So if we say to ourselves that the reason we should restore is to try and protect the loss of a certain species, that makes a lot of sense. So it makes a lot of sense then to invest in removing the novel ecosystem and putting back an ecosystem, because we're choosing to protect or conserve a particular species of vole, or an insect, or perhaps other things. So that makes a lot of sense. However, nature is not static, and so we could restore something unless it's a very small island where we have a lot of control, perhaps, as we think we do, and it's quite far from the nearest wind that would bring species across. Even still, we still don't think that we could retain the one from the idyllic past. And this is something you might, it's almost like you see those movies where someone's looking through a telescope at the crosshairs, like the sharpshooter or an assassin, and it's moving around. So where do we land? Where does the bullet hit? That's the point in the past that we should go for, because that's the point where that particular species was the most prevalent or dominant. Let's say the wolf or something like that. But so you or aquatic animals. But you could just as easily say, well, if we move it a little bit further forward, we could have that and another species. So it's still the debate is about time, and it's also about place. If we were to go back far enough, for example, in Ireland, in the previous, before the last ice age and after the ice age before that, the climate and the ecosystem in Ireland had very different species than it currently has today. If we were to restore, for example, should we not go back to those? But those species, some of them are considered invasive species today in the country. Okay, like, for example, Sitka spruce or rhododendron, perhaps. I'm not sure the exact list, but they would have been prevalent, or they're an analog of them would have been prevalent in the past, and again before that. So it gets a bit silly. So a lot of the times they say, well, we go back to a time before major damage occurred. And so they tend to look to just before the Middle Ages. But as you quite pointed out earlier on, we've been doing damage a lot, all the time. However, in those days, there was significantly less humans. And so therefore, the impact of damage was usually offset by rapid regrowth. So therefore, the Amazon was heavily farmed. What we now know is the Amazon rainforest was heavily farmed and had huge population centers. When Europeans brought smallpox and eradicated peoples, the rainforest we now know grows back. So if we were to be strictly restorationistic, we should go back to either the farmed area or even before that again. But it also depends on what we know about the past. What we know about the past would fill more books. What we don't know about the past would fill more books than what we do know. We might know the numbers of species, but we don't know how they interacted all the time. And we only know the species we can see in, let's say, fossil records or specific records. We don't have as big a picture as perhaps we would need to validate that what we're doing now today to restore something. We've got all the species ticked off. We've done it. And then we walk away, and all of a sudden all the other guys come back in again. The ones, the invasive bits, because we've only done it in a certain location. We haven't done it everywhere. That's what the restoration law, that's what those things are aiming at doing on a much wider scale. And in some cases, it's not about restoring something to the past. It's about rewilding or renaturing something. So giving more space to nature, and just leave it at that, and let the ecologists just decide what is the nature we're talking about. And so therefore, it might be an agricultural habitats or, other types of things. So yeah, there's a very, very hot debate going on, and it will continue.
What's your view? Like, how important, in air quotes, are invasive or non-native species? Because we see this thing, and this is again not wanting to go into specifics, but I one instance where I was talking with a colleague of mine, and he brought the argument. He started talking about gray squirrels. And it's like, well, like why people want to get rid of gray squirrels, that's not, the reason why, right? And I go like, ha, 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 let me tell you. And I started explaining that to him. And after a while, I was thinking to myself, like, Tommy, you're making a really weak-ass argument. Like, I wasn't convincing to myself about the so so curious to your view on, like, where to draw the line, or are there any set of indicators that would say, hey, well, like, that species is non-native, but actually it fills the niche, or it's, easier or quote unquote cheaper to get the original one extinct, or not worry about it because this one is now filling that the niche, and that is okay. And also, like we mentioned, the species that are being moved from place to place, or even that are moving under its own devices, right? So, for example, golden jackal that is colonizing parts of Europe, and there's like, well, it comes here on this, nobody brought it, it's natural, right? But then someone said like, yeah, haha, but the climate change, it's not natural. Because how to navigate that landscape, and how to even attempt to make a correct decision, which can have a huge implications financially and operationally if you decide to eradicate a species like New Zealand, where they want to eradicate the Himalayan tar, which doesn't do any, much damage as far as I know, but it's non-native. So someone decided how to navigate that.
First of all, I personally try as much as I possibly can not to use the phrase native and non-native. First of all, the phrase native and non-native, it comes from a very dubious European past in the 1930s, Central Europe, shall we say, where it was mixed in with race. And before that, ecologists, or they wouldn't call themselves ecologists, scientists in the natural world would have used neophytes and archaeophytes. So neophytes, plants that are relatively recently arrived in the place, or animals, and archaeophytes, ones that we find in, let's say, the archaeological record, or in a longer past. Was no particular line, was no ancient woodland is any woodland from 1500 onwards. So if we planted a woodland in 1499, it would be considered an ancient woodland. But if you planted in 1501, it would be not considered an ancient woodland. So that type of sort of useless argument, if you think about it. But, it'd be nice to see a woodland that's been around 500 years. It'd be fantastic to go into. It'd be really lovely. And there's places that we can go to see that. So I tend to look at and the other part of all this native and not is that we just don't know. We have a fair share of them. But if we put that aside for a moment, the invasive species has long been shown to have catastrophic effects. So like rats on islands, and pigs and cats in Australia, and cats everywhere. Actually, if you think about it, they're quite damaging to environment, nature, and so on. Like a lot of things that were deliberately introduced, like the starling or the sparrow, the starling in the United States, and every country has its this horrible plant. And if you look at eucalyptus in California, and then California redwoods in Australia, and they've swapped their invasive species, et cetera, and we have it everywhere. Prickly pear all over the European, cactus all over the Europe and so on. So there's everywhere. So in situations where there is a species that is so dominant that it's pushing everything out, well, at that stage, something has to be done. Question is, there are other species that would be considered native to an area and can also become invasive. So a good example I would use of that is the hazel, which is an indigenous, an archaeophyte in Ireland, dominating parts of the Burren, which is a created landscape. The biodiversity of the Burren was put there by people grazing animals. But when they take animals away and stop the grazing, this hazel comes back. So we've got an example of a Burren flora which contains plants that are neophytes that have come from alpine areas and are finding their way in Ireland, being threatened by the indigenous plant hazel, which they're now calling for to be removed in order to consider grazing. Or we could just go out and get a bunch of soil, put it back on top of the burn, because we are the ones who caused the thing to go in the first place. So again, if you just look at that scenario, there's about 50 different choices you could make at any stage in that argument to say we should go restore, not restore, do restore, don't restore, do some grazing, don't do grazing. It's become so complex that no one single prescription will solve the problem, will cure the problem. And then also there'll be people who won't find it is cured the way other people think it's cured. So I might think, oh yeah, that's great ecosystems, but it doesn't contain this bird or that wasp or this animal. And you go, we've fallen short, and all the while this is going on, the temperature is going, the patterns are changing, the population is growing, and the technology is going. So all the while we argue and we try to do things are constantly in the change. And they're changing over shorter periods of time, but nature likes longer periods of time. And that's the other part of your argument, your discussion there, that we don't have enough length of a lifespan. We don't live long enough to know the real, like for an ecosystem, it's thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. For us, it's a small space, and we want to see results quickly because we're paying for this, coming out of taxpayers' money. It's coming out of the budget. So we're paying for it. So we better get it done quickly. So you go in there, shove the things in and cross your fingers and call it restored. Not necessarily the case. And then on top of all of that, we have a lot of restoration work going on around the world. We've got fantastic examples where ecosystems have been restored or expanded. Two ecosystems that were disconnected from each other now are being reunited through a much larger, it's fantastic stuff going on in different parts of the world. And really a lot of work being done by millions of people to do this. At the same time, we're not very good at going back and checking. We don't do enough post-activity assessment or analysis. We don't do enough post-science just to show that we just go and look and say, yeah, it looks very like that picture we have of that forest or that coral reef that we saw on the television. It looked very similar. They must be restored. It doesn't actually mean it is. It just means it's in that period of trying to restore itself. We've given it a bit of a kickstart, but it could simply slip back, or it could go in a novel direction that we weren't kind of expecting. We've gone, well, it's gone too far the wrong way. We need to go in and start meddling again. So one of my colleagues has referred to restoration ecology as intelligent tinkering. This is a really nice way. And I remember we were discussing it once. He said, that movie where people take apart a watch and all the tiny pieces, and then they put it all back together. And the watch is working, and then they realize there's a piece not in there, and they go, "Oh, but it's working. It's still working. It's still the ecosystem. But like, what's this? Where does this go? Oh, well, look, just throw it away, and hopefully it'll be the best." So that's kind of because we're kind of clunky as a species. We try to think we're sophisticated. We're not.
Yeah, and the complexity of those systems are just mind blowing. So I'm not surprised that we just like intelligent tinkering. It's a good phrase. Marcus, you mentioned on the top of the show cultural ecosystems. I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on it. What are those cultural or ecosystems? How they're Is it not like oxymoron that ecosystem is supposed to be natural and nature not necessarily cultural, because cultural implies that there people are there, and that maybe, to me is a discussion about national parks in Ireland and in the UK, that these are not national parks because you have sheeps and sheep grazing and other stuff, and it's like, okay, but there's a national park that preserving heritage and the cultural landscapes as well. And then again, there's this tension and discussion. So could you help us to understand better what are those cultural ecosystems, how they're at odds or maybe not with ecological ecosystems like we would understand that traditionally?
So what I was talking about in the past was ecosystem services, the things that nature gives to us, and in a cultural way, they give us things like health and well-being. They give us psychological well-being. They give us, in some cases, artistic and spiritual device. So that's the nature gives us the cultural. Now, cultural landscapes tend to be rather like novel ecosystems. They're landscapes that are like, for example, agricultural landscapes. The network of hedgerows in England and Ireland, Britain and Ireland, is a good example of a cultural landscape. It is completely artificial. Hedgerows don't exist in the wild. They're completely created by people, and have been for quite a long period of time. So much so that when they were brought in first, there were huge amounts of riots because you're destroying the beautiful open landscape that Turner and Constable painted, and you're destroying it by enclosing and privatizing all this landscape. Now, when we go to remove landscapes, you're destroying the culture. So it's the culture has changed, and we've adapted, and we've become familiar with them, and now we realize they've got so much importance to our lives. And it's interesting you mentioned about national parks. With the exception of the Burren, our national parks in Ireland are people's gardens once in the past. They're someone's fancy garden that designed areas, and parts of the UK as well. And so they were like, Powerscourt Estate or Glenveigh Estate or Killarney Estate. These are wealthy landlords who basically, with whatever, let's not get into the history and the ins and outs of the past, but, things were done and which were not favorable to humans, but they basically created these things which we now go back and celebrate as our national parks, even though people were turfed off the land and exported to other countries to do that in places like Scotland and Ireland and Wales. So a cultural landscape is very much it's a human landscape, human created landscape, and humans are very much in evidence in it. So there's like linear structures like hedges, and there's lines of trees along a road. That's a culture. Someone decided. We now know that they have high values to us that are beyond the culture. They've got high biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and shade and shelter in terms of urban trees. Huge values that can really be life-saving in many situations. But in the past, they were a symbol of someone's design choice. They chose to put London planes on the north and south circular roads, and they chose to plant chestnut trees in parks, to make them look good, And now, of course, you sit under them, they're 250 years old. I think this is a magnificent specimen of a tree, and it's so cool under here, and it's lovely to sit there. We get huge value out of something which someone put in is basically like we couldn't afford a sculpture, so we planted a tree. So cultural landscapes are huge. Now that's in our parts of the world. When we start looking at other parts where cultural landscapes are, for example, Australia, New Zealand, or parts of the Inuit people in North America, and where we have indigenous communities still very much in connection with their landscape, albeit very much altered by European historical disturbance. They have a cultural relationship with the landscape that is visible in rock art. It's invisible with their songs and music. Where the value of this for us has become in disciplines such as ethnobotany and ethnozoology, in looking at how indigenous peoples or peoples from the past, not necessarily always has to be indigenous, but people from the past, how they spoke about, wrote about their nature, we can build a picture of that past ecosystem that perhaps we could restore to. So if you look at how we know what animals live in British Columbia is by looking at the totem poles that were there. We don't need to go out looking for the bears, but we can know because they've been there for a long time. We know but they were the animals that indigenous peoples met and encountered all the time. But we also know it from their music. We know it from their stories. We know it from our own stories, our Greek myths and our legends. We know about things in the past in songs and even in patterns that are on traditional clothing. Tells you what plants and what animals were there in the past. And there are a small group of people, fascinating people, ethnobotanists, who are able to discern what those plants were that, let's say, what we would have called hunter-gatherers. They're not really hunting and gathering. They're also sowing things and then moving off and then coming back years later and gathering them in the places like the Pacific Northwest and in the Amazon rainforest. We know that people do this. And we can piece together that connection. So in restoring nature in that location, we're doing not just restoring nature, we're also restoring culture, restoring our cultural relationships. And that actually has huge societal benefits in terms of bringing cohesion to communities and being able to use that sort of reconnecting with nature to tackle some of the, let's say, other issues such as obesity or other issues that might be happening because of the changes. So cultural landscapes and cultural connections with landscapes can be incredibly important to understand, because when we do understand it, we can actually use it. It's a very good tool to be able to reconnect people with nature, but also to be able to, improve people's well-being, regardless of where they are.
And that gives us a good segue to, I think, nature-based solution. And I know that you talked a lot and you have papers out as well about urban spaces and urban environments. I, correctly or incorrectly, but I see some of the similarities. Like you said, like people were planting hedges or doing something in the environment where they live. Now we have this thing called cities, and we have some moves towards like, hey, let's have a park, maybe let's plant some trees, and then all of a sudden we see like, oh, well, actually the climate is changing, it's hotter and hotter, and now if we have a little bit of trees and a little bit of a grass instead of concrete, that actually is a good thing. So and again, it's a very much open question, or not even a question, just a discussion point. Is there a similarities between these old, cultural landscapes and what we're trying to do now in the cities, and how that's going?
Yes, I mean, you couldn't get more cultural relationships than the nature we have on our doorstep, in our cities, in our gardens, in our living rooms, in our bathrooms. We bring nature into these places, and then we try to get some nature out. The spider people will back me up on this. But we do, so culture, and it's very much dependent on a lot of things. I mean, our upbringing, our environment, and in terms of our education and so on and so forth. So a lot of things at play here. But you're right, when it comes to cities, renaturing, regreening our cities, and viewing these as nature-based solutions, these as not only providing services to humans, but also in us doing that, we're actually making more places green. If you look at places like Berlin, where they've had a huge wilding initiatives in everywhere you look, it's an incredibly green city. You look at Vienna, it's almost a small forest. The bits of Vienna we see in the movies is just actually the most. They're there probably because they're the only ones that the cameras can see, because everywhere else you go in Vienna, there's trees in the way. And there's other cities around the world that are doing their best. So yes, very much so. It's a symbol. It's the amount of greenery there is in a city reflects what the values of maybe the previous generations would have had on nature, and we're setting ourselves by creating living roofs and living walls and other structures. And doing a lot of urban forestry, urban wetlands, those type of things. They will be the indicator for future generations of what the past felt about nature. And they will have learned from that. So this is the continuum we have. So yeah, it is cities are very much at the forefront here. They're only 3% of the planet would be classified as urban. But it reuses about 90% of the global resources, in terms of agricultural land, or to feed and clothe and give energy to the city. So the city itself, though, is a mark of who we are. And it's, yes, okay, there's changing politics all the time. But after a while, we start to see since they put that park in our neighborhood, crime has gone down. Since they put that park in the neighborhood, admissions to hospital with asthma has gone down. We start to put health and well-being metrics together that, again, time comes into this, that we only know over a certain period of time. We notice that when we pedestrianize or when we bring more parks in, business and income goes up. Income goes up when we pedestrianize, not down. Or when we put in parks. So we see things. Now, don't get me wrong here, there are other negative effects. There's gentrification that could happen. So as more greenery goes in, property values go up, and that pushes out the people who really need to have access to nature. They may not have a garden. They may not have a park in their area. And if we put a park in for them, but that increases their rent, then they've got to move somewhere else, and the cycle starts all over again, perhaps. So there are negative sides to this, but in general, the positive part of it is that the more we regreen, the better our well-being is, and that will change us behaviorally and culturally, but over a longer period of time, I think.
So given the situation we're in right now, biodiversity crisis unfolding, climate is changing, what role and what percentage of a role in addressing those have those nature-based solutions? In other words, is it either nature-based solutions or nothing? That's the only hope? Or is it some technological solutions even worth considering or working on? How do you see this? And more specifically, we have, for example, water quality issues in Ireland. And are there any good nature-based solutions for that, for example?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll come to the water in a second. Yes, there's very good nature-based solutions. But to answer the first one, we should be throwing the kitchen sink at this. So nature-based solutions is just one approach. There are engineered-based solutions. There are cultural-based or social-based solutions. There are economic solutions or models that could be the way that we should be putting absolutely everything that we possibly can to tackle it. So nature is not going to tackle the problem by itself. Nature needs to be maintained. It's not cheap. If you have a living roof, it's got to be, be looked after. It isn't. You can't just put something in the ground and let it hopefully do the job for you. It has to be part of a model that you invest in, and it is just like you invest in a big pipeline. You have to gray infrastructure depreciates over time, and you've got to replace it. Green infrastructure actually appreciates over time, but it still needs to be maintained. So we need to be throwing the absolute kitchen sink, and there should be everything we do, from building to shopping to every decision that is possible to be made, needs to be thought of again, that its sustainability impact needs to be measured. And if there's going to be a high cost to that, well, that's what we should be investing in, as opposed to investing in, let's say, fly-by-night solutions that we'll hopefully invent something that we can spray in the air or put a big space mirror up and all that type of malarkey, which is rubbish. Complete rubbish. But yet there are entrepreneurs who will remain nameless on their own certain social media networks that will possibly be investing billions of other people's money, perhaps, into big space umbrellas and weirdness like that. We're not going to be able to turn down the heat in the same way as people visualize it as heat going up. We could just turn around and turn it down again. It's going to keep going. Momentum is such now we're in a path that is unlikely to reverse no matter what we do. But if we don't do something, it'll get much worse. So we need to be throwing the nature. And I think with nature-based solutions, some cities that are wet cities, like our own one, like in Dublin, having a lot of trees could be quite good in terms of allowing the soil to process the excess rainfall. But you can also have nature-based solutions for rivers that are, for example, that beavers actually provide. We just mimic what they do. We have natural or artificial dams that slow down the water. I've got colleagues here in Trinity College who have, what they call leaky dams, where the river is allowed, the water fills up, but it's allowed to perforate through. So it's not gushing down at one go. It's slow release. It's attenuated. And it's allowed, so it doesn't overwhelm the drain systems or the people's land, which is we've copied from beavers. So we have a nature-based solution approach, but we also have biomimicry support. We imitate what nature's doing. We use maybe technology for that, whereas in the nature-based, we use nature for it. So in fact, I do get into trouble every so often. I start like nature-based solutions can actually be argued to be looking at nature like it is a technology. And it's doing, that of course, just to quickly say after that, that is also looking at nature in the wrong way that has caused us to split from it in the first place, going back to what we were talking earlier on. Because if we look at all it provides us, its services, we are still not getting the proper picture. That we are part of the nature, we are part of it, and it is us that we have to also change. We have to change our behavior. So that's the big thing. So yes, there are aquatic and nature-based solutions, both marine and freshwater. And we have plenty of opportunities for doing these things, but they are actually infrastructure that needs to be invested in, looked after, and we still need to measure their impact when we're finished, which we tend not to do as much as we should.
That's perfect. You mentioned that you have an example of a nature-based solution for the water quality.
So yeah, things like tertiary treatment, where we have different sets of ponds that would the water would flow. It's used a lot in agricultural settings where water that is containing a lot of extra nutrient, effluent essentially, goes into one, and then gradually the plants in there remove the toxins. The water builds up and goes into the next one and the next one, and by the time it gets to the other end of its flow rate, the water wouldn't be drinkable, although you could possibly, but it wouldn't be as toxic or as acidic perhaps as it would have been. So these wastewater treatment, these natural wastewater treatment plants, in some cases they can be done on very large state basis where a whole small town could actually feed into it, or it could be done if you have a large enough piece of land in your farm, for example, to treat the effluent that's coming out of the milking parlors or other places where we get incredibly high and highly acidic as well, and highly nutrient rich runoff. And it runs into the land, and of course that gives rise to diseases to humans in our groundwater. But if we can slow that down, let plants do the job, that is a very good nature-based solution.
That's immensely interesting. Marcus, listen, thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for your time. Any words of wisdom for our listeners?
Words of wisdom. I think my family will probably disagree with that. Oh, he's going on again. I think for me, the way I see it is when we bring wild nature, or we bring nature, we get more connectivity with nature. There's no real ill effects. And yes, okay, I get pollen hay fever when but it's a minor inconvenience when I realize that just what it does to you, what it does in terms of stress, what it can do in terms of impacting on your daily life. We noticed this during COVID. When people were restricted to where they can go, they could only see green things in their garden or on their balconies or on their roof. And we were inundated here, and a lot of the universities were with people sending photographs like, what's this? I just noticed it. People were noticing nature. And it's since COVID, a lot of studies have come out now of showing that relationship to nature has got huge health and well-being effects. So if we rewild our cities, we can also rewild ourselves, the human, bring the human back closer to nature. So it's not causing getting the person to wear all sorts of weedy plants and flowers on their heads. It's to rewild them and to bring them closer. It's not by any means some sort of conspiracy or weird thing. It's actually pretty good if you see, for example, how well connected with nature, say, certain children can be. They can really be completely and utterly comfortable. They're rolling around. There's no thoughts of nettles as stinging right there. They're 100%. If we can bring that part of that understanding of nature closer to people, that could help to alter our behavior towards nature and ultimately our behavior towards the way we treat nature and the planet. That's my
Thank you so much.
Small word of wisdom. You're welcome.
Absolutely. It's not small. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much.